With its meteoric rise to historic levels of success, the 2016 feature Your Name brought its director Makoto Shinkai to unforeseen levels of worldwide prominence, adding copious amounts of fuel to the question that had been burning since the start of his career. Is Makoto Shinkai the next No, we're not gonna do that here. Even if the parading around of Shinkais and Hosodas as Miyazaki's successors isn't as tired and dull as I believe the question to be inherently, it's certainly been run into the ground to a point of tiredness through the immense amount of discussion of that idea. There's nothing new to be said on it for now, and no remaining points of interest. No, the next Miyazaki question that I find significantly more compelling is, who does Ghibli think is the next Miyazaki? Or at the very least, who do they think can be his successor? It's a question that they've actually been asking themselves for over 2 decades now, searching for someone, anyone, to succeed the master and keep the studio alive and running without him once he finally stops leaving retirement. It's also a question whose answer increasingly looks to be, there is no one to fill that role. But the long and tumultuous journey to that answer is a fascinating one. And a key player in that journey is, without further ado, let us set out on the journey to find the successor to Hayao Miyazaki. For the first decade after its founding in 1985, a time period that saw Studio Ghibli produce 7 feature films, every one of those features was directed by one of the studio's 2 founding directors, Hayao Miyazaki or Isao Takahata. It was during this time that they first branched out and tried having someone other than the 2 of them direct a Ghibli production, and this would be the first of a number of unfortunate results from doing so. 1993's made-for-TV film, Umi ga Kikoeru, is really an excellent film. It's certainly a step below the typical Ghibli production quality, but that still puts it a flight or 2 of steps above the majority of anime. It's one of the more criticized Ghibli films, and generally one of the more common contenders for their worst, but when I watched it I was pleasantly surprised by just how engrossing the characters were. The highlight for me is when the male and female lead end up spending the night together in a hotel, because of how genuine and natural that ended up feeling, when such scenes are so often taken as the opportunity for anime shenanigans. When I first watched the film at 17 or 18, I was struck by the mature sense of subdued sexual tension to a situation that remains comfortably platonic that the scene conveys, and it embodies the overall maturity of characterization that's put on display over the course of its extremely pleasant runtime. So, where's that misfortune? Relative youngster Tomomi Mochizuki was brought in to direct, and indeed, the whole idea behind the production was for almost all of it to be done by younger staff members, those in their 20s and 30s, with their motto being to produce quickly, cheaply, and with quality. But those former 2 proved to be an issue, with the production going both over budget and over time. Soon after that, it was 1995, a decade since Ghibli had been founded, and the year Whisper of the Heart was released. Hayao Miyazaki wrote this film and handed off directorial duties to Yoshifumi Kondo, a man that Miyazaki reportedly expressed a great deal of affection towards and trust in, and who he seemed to be preparing to be his successor. And Whisper of the Heart was a great success. It ended up being the top-grossing Japanese film that year in the domestic market and highly praised, falling right in line with that dependable Ghibli critical and commercial success. It also definitely warranted that. Whisper of the Heart is a wonderful film, warm, inviting, and nostalgic. At its core, it's the story of 2 aspiring artists finding love, both for the pursuits of those passions in spite of uncertain futures that doing so would bring, and also, eventually, for each other. It's inspiring and validating, with the line, "You've worked so hard, you're wonderful," encapsulating this appeal. Unfortunately, Yoshifumi Kondo ended up working a bit too hard. He served as an animation director and character designer on Miyazaki's next film, Princess Mononoke, released in 1997. Miyazaki is estimated to have redrawn 80,000 of the film's 144,000 frames himself, but he was not the only one putting in a Herculean effort. And on January 21st, 1998, 2 decades ago exactly, in a few weeks here, Kondo passed away due to a heart aneurysm that was diagnosed as being the result of overwork. You may be aware of Miyazaki's retirement announcement in 1998 following the release of Princess Mononoke, and the passing of Kondo, someone he cared about deeply, was reportedly a factor in that decision to retire. Though, as we all know, Miyazaki would eventually be back. However, following his return film, Spirited Away, he seemed to be back in a somewhat more reluctant manner. In 2002, Studio Ghibli released the next film that served as a testing ground for possible new directors, The Cat Returns. Fittingly, this film was based upon an expanded story developed around one of the characters from their last such effort, the Baron from Whisper of the Heart. The man chosen to direct it was Hiroyuki Morita, a talented animator who had done work under Katsuhiro Otomo, Satoshi Kon, and Studio Ghibli in both Kiki's Delivery Service and My Neighbors the Yamadas. This film was a real highlight for me as a child, with a pretty classical fairy tale style that fully capitalizes on Ghibli's ability to create convincing and captivating fantasy. And, as usual, it was yet another critical and commercial success, once again earning the highest domestic gross of any Japanese film the year it released. Information on his situation with the studio is scant, but for some reason, Morita would not return to direct another Ghibli feature, and in fact his only future role as sole director would be Bokurano Hours in 2007. It is that production that may perhaps hold some insight into his ensuing parting with Ghibli. You see, Bokurano's anime adaptation has a decent bit of infamy for its divergence from the manga source material, mostly because those changes were due to Morita's openly expressed dislike of that manga. In a blog post about the series, titled, "I Give Up," Morita ended with, "The director of the animated version of Bokurano dislikes the original manga. From here on out, you can't expect the animated version to expand on what you might find appealing in the original. So, fans of the original, please do not watch the animated version from now on." Which is a bit of a not great move. Just maybe, probably, definitely, oh god, what were you thinking, Morita? From this post, he certainly comes off as a bit self-centered and disagreeable, which may be the reason behind his separation from Ghibli. He also specifically notes Howl's Moving Castle as an example of the difficulty of adapting works to anime, so that thrown shade could be some bitterness from him over a less than cordial parting, or it could be something he had an issue with at the time, and which helped lead to that parting of ways. Either way, that seems to have marked the peak of his career. He's been doing some occasional storyboarding and animation work throughout the years since. His most recent work seems to have been on Suka Suka earlier last year, but hasn't had any higher roles than that, not so much as an episode director credit, aside from the 2012 One Piece film Hand Island Adventure, where he was the co-director. Yet another directorial hopeful for Ghibli who just didn't end up working out. One hopeful that really didn't work out was Mamoru Hosoda. That's right, at one point he actually was supposed to be the next Miyazaki. In 2001, so this would be right after his work on Digimon Our War Game and his famous pair of directed episodes of Ojamajo Doremi, he was selected to direct Howl's Moving Castle. This marked the first time that someone who had not worked for or with Ghibli previously was going to direct a feature-length Ghibli production, but that milestone didn't actually come. It seems that after repeated rejections of his concept submissions, all found to be unsatisfactory, they gave up on having him as the director, and it ended up falling upon Hayao Miyazaki to direct this one as well, the follow-up to Spirited Away from him. Ghibli's next production after Howl's was yet another demonstration of Hayao's seeming lessened desire to direct himself, and, in spite of its approval on the basis that Hayao would direct it, the Miyazaki directing the 2006 film Tales from Earthsea would end up being Goro Miyazaki, the son of Hayao. Certainly, the son of the master seems like a solid candidate to succeed him, but Goro did not get off to a great start. First off, that start did not come with his father's blessing. Goro had been observed as reluctant to follow in his father's footsteps, and studied to become a landscaper, eventually doing design work for the Ghibli Museum and becoming its director. And so he did no work in anime. But Toshio Suzuki, the producer that founded Ghibli alongside Hayao Miyazaki and Isao Takahata, wanted Goro to direct. At first, Goro was simply brought onto the Earthsea project as a consultant. Then, he was asked to draw some storyboards, and after seeing those, Suzuki decided Goro should direct the film. This urging on Suzuki's part was partially due to the reticence by Hayao, still present. Apparently, this was yet another point in time where he wanted to retire. That didn't mean he wanted to retire from expressing his opinion, however, as he was very clear about his belief that Goro did not have the necessary experience to direct the film. Reportedly, the two of them did not speak to each other during the film's development. In the end, the film would get some level of approval from Hayao, with his words being, "It was made honestly. It was good." But the press was not quite as kind to it. While Tales of Earthsea did receive positive reviews, it was a significantly more mixed positive than those of Ghibli films past. While its box office revenue did triple its production budget and lead it to be the 4th highest grossing film in Japan for 2006, it also won Japan's Raspberry Awards for both Worst Movie and Worst Director, and is the pretty wide pick for Worst Ghibli Film, being the only one with a rotten on Rotten Tomatoes. Hayao Miyazaki would direct Ghibli's next film, Ponyo, which premiered in 2008, and that seemed to be a real refreshing experience for him. Its goal was simply to celebrate the innocence and joy of childhood, and he went back to basics, intending only to use traditional animation, where previously the studio had been working some CG into their filmmaking. Goro's next directed film would be written by Hayao, this collaborative effort marking a stark difference from the interpersonal atmosphere of Goro's previous film. And indeed, From Up on Poppy Hill is an incredible tale of conflict between the older generation and those coming after them, of the battle between progress and traditionalism, and of coming to find a reconciliation between those two groups. It's one of my very favorite Ghibli films. The setting is brilliantly crafted, both in the broad strokes painting a perfect picture of the period it portrays, and on a smaller scale, with perhaps my single favorite location in anime, the Latin Quarter. Goro Miyazaki had really come into his own as a director with this film, and the Latin Quarter was his most impressive accomplishment. It's incredibly dense and chaotic, and absolutely gushing youthful industrious energy from every possible orifice, all thanks to the fantastic execution of it. While its box office earnings were slightly less than those of Earthsea, the critical reception was much less shaky, making Poppy Hill Goro's first unequivocal success. Interestingly, data showed that the film's audience was actually 57% female to 43% male. So, guilty as charged, I guess. And yet, in spite of this improved reception, while his father was getting creatively reinvigorated, Goro seemed a bit uncertain about his own creative future. In the unquestionably must-watch documentary The Kingdom of Dreams and Madness, we see a meeting between Goro, Suzuki, and another producer, where they are practically begging him to agree to come direct this unnamed project. He expresses insecurity over his own abilities, still saying that he lacks experience relative to what he should have for the level of responsibility he's being given. He talks about the reasons why he would be motivated to continue making animation at all. Much like nearly the entire runtime of the documentary, it's an utterly fascinating conversation, and one whose unnamed subject we can probably guess. The only thing Goro has directed beyond the two films we've discussed has been Ronja, the Robber's Daughter, which premiered just about a year after Kingdom of Dreams and Madness did, so it seems he did finally give in to Suzuki's insistences. This co-production with CG studio Polygon Pictures was also well received, even winning the kids animation category at the 2016 International Emmys. But with no word of upcoming projects from Goro since the conclusion of Ronja, and talk of Ghibli shutting down in spite of his seeming availability, it seems like that may have been his last work, or at least his last with the studio, and he didn't end up being the one to carry their torch. There is, however, one other candidate, one final hope, who had also been getting a chance to try out for the role all this time as Goro Miyazaki was doing the same: Hiromasa Yonebayashi. No more inexperienced newbies, no more unfamiliar outsiders. The last attempt at a director to succeed Hayao Miyazaki and Isao Takahata was a Ghibli thoroughbred, a company man through and through. He got his start in the anime industry in his early 20s with Princess Mononoke, and worked on almost every Ghibli film following it, along with some of the studio's shorts and specials. Just as Miyazaki had done for Kondo back on Whisper of the Heart, he wrote the script for Yonebayashi's directorial debut, 2010's The Secret of Arrietty, and in addition to that served as production planner on the film. It's a very solid all-around movie, and prototypical Ghibli. It's got a wonderful sense of fantasy and adventure, the trademark beautiful presentation, and a strong sense of humanity underlying the whole affair. One of my favorite elements is the Irish influence for some of the soundtrack here, that gives it a pretty unique and for me personally nostalgic air. In its critical reception, it received much praise, but a bit of light criticism as well, being said to not quite fully capture the magic of the Ghibli greats. But the box office poll seemed to soundly disagree there. It became the highest grossing anime film in the US that hadn't been a game adaptation, and worldwide it is the 8th highest grossing anime film of all time, just below Princess Mononoke, and beating things like The Wind Rises and Pokémon the Movie 2000. Yonebayashi would have one more film at Ghibli, and unfortunately, it would not be met with that same success. Yeah, I'm gonna start off with this here. The inspired musical selection that showed up on his previous film really showed itself with this single from the film's OST, a song I ran into on YouTube and which proceeded to shred my soul for a few months, building an insane anticipation for the film just so I could finally get the catharsis of its use in context. In revisiting when Marnie was there for this script, I realized that it has way too many big feels for discussion here, but needless to say, I deeply love this film, and it's probably gonna need a dedicated video soon here. Unfortunately, it just didn't seem like it could quite find its audience. By the way, that audience is totally lesbians. All my fellow sapphic viewers, go get on this right now. And had a rather disappointing box office revenue of $34 million. Now, this was still a decent bit above its production budget of $10.5 million, which is more than could be said for the Ghibli film that directly preceded it, Takahata's Tale of Princess Kaguya. However, with that film being long over time and over budget, failing to even earn back half of what it cost to produce, both Hayao Miyazaki and Isao Takahata seemingly looking to retire, Goro Miyazaki having to get dragged against his will into directing if he was to direct at all, and Yonebayashi's film seemingly unable to capture the Ghibli spirit, and unable to capture the Ghibli box office pull now that he had made a film that didn't involve Miyazaki, and get to market itself as such, the studio seemed like it would be closing its doors and ending production. Miyazaki and Takahata were remarkable craftsmen who catapulted their studio to the forefront of Japanese animation, but the shadows they cast were so long that in spite of over 2 decades of attempts to find someone who could, no one was able to step outside them. The quest was over. There is no next Miyazaki. But just because Ghibli was winding down production, downsizing, and saying they had no planned productions at that point, that didn't mean that Yonebayashi was satisfied. He had been the youngest person to direct clearly a talented and driven artist, and so he, along with Ghibli producer Yoshiaki Nishimura and many now freed up Ghibli staff, left the studio to go form their own Studio Ponoc. The name comes from a Croatian term meaning midnight, as this studio is meant to be the end of one era and the dawning of a new one, a place for the Ghibli production ethos to live on, even if the studio itself does not. And the studio's first film, sponsored to advertise, is such an excellent showcase of that ethos, while also making some improvements to it even. Hayao Miyazaki is infamous for his controlling touch and commanding vision. While Isao Takahata will get more wild, expressive, and experimental, everything in Hayao's films adheres to a strict style set by him and him alone. It's why he corrects so much animation himself. This tendency of his has been described as stifling, as snuffing out the individual idiosyncratic expressiveness of the individual animators working on his film. And with Mary and the Witch's Flower, Yonebayashi's lack of that control is evident and welcome. The film has a huge amount of talent. There was a wealth of Ghibli staff to bring it to life, and we get to witness many of them in as unrestrained a state as they've ever been. Productions like Your Name and Made in Abyss have already been made possible because of this newly freed up pool of talent. And if we'll have Studio Ponoc to keep that Ghibli tradition alive and active, then maybe this procession of events will have been for the best. It truly seems like the long and trying search was unsuccessful, like there is no next Miyazaki. That man was truly one of a kind. But what we do have is the next Hosoda, the next Yonebayashi, creators with their own identities, own styles, and now, own studios. Opportunity. And as always, a massive thank you to everyone supporting me as well. The switch over to monthly patronage last month was a big, somewhat blind leap, but thanks to the incredible support from you guys, I was able to land it relatively unscathed. And of course, great opportunities like this help make up that difference. An especial thank you goes out to Psyker, Carkeys, MathWiz97, Jonathan Conley, Skylar Morrow, Tyler Monk, Sakamoto Mio, Tincho37, Josh Grant, Lord Liquid Bacon II, Kim Darling, Joaquim Alfelt, Darian Day Sotel, Azure Zero, David McCown, Kieran Rice, and all the rest of you folks supporting me through Patreon. Thank you. Yes, one take.